Right. We're almost bang on time, despite the pre-match entertainment, for which I apologise. I'm not quite sure what's happened to it, but whatever has happened, we can't solve it. I don't know how much you can see. If you want to jiggle around when the slides come up, then please do. Stand up or explain what it is to the person behind. But thank you all very much for coming this evening. And before I introduce Niall, just a couple of things. You've got flyers on your chairs for the next two events. One is a seminar on the Somme, and the other is the last of the evening talks on the Army Postal Service in World War I. You will shortly be getting next year's list of speakers and talks, and I hope you will enjoy coming along to them. We've got a bit of a variety. We have Vic Gregg, who is an ex-RB veteran who, strangely enough, fought through North Africa and Italy, joined the parachute regiment, dropped into Arnhem, was captured, escaped, taken to Auschwitz, and was on a work party from Auschwitz when Dresden was bombed and destroyed. And he has quite a story to tell. The only trouble with Greg is if you turn him on, it's very difficult to turn him off. So we have somebody who's his publisher coming along to facilitate or chair that talk. There's one down here, don't you see? We then have got General Rupert Smith to talk on the 25th anniversary of the First Gulf War. And he's going to be partnered by Martin White, who is in charge of the logistics. That should be quite a good evening. But that's going to be not in here, but in Christchurch Church, just down the road, where we can get in a few more people. Other speakers, you have somebody for a bit of different subject, going to talk about the medieval sniper, who is a bit of an expert in medieval warfare and longbows. You then have got me talking about Mike Sinclair, who was one of the greatest escapers of the Second World War, known as the Red Fox of Colditz. A very good story, admirably put across. And then we have another couple of speakers, one talking about Combray, and Andrew Lambert coming back to talk about the Crimea and the war in the Crimea and the larger aspects of the Russian influence on that particular part of the world. But turning to today, we have Niall with us. Thank you very much for coming along. Thank you for bearing with us through all this and going through the indignity of having the headlight fitted as well. Niall is going to talk to us about the campaign in North Africa. And I've spoken for long enough, so I shall sit down and listen with interest.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here at the Green Jackets Museum. My youngest son was going to come with me. He then had an attack of homework, but he is now in the cadets in the Rifles in Oxfordshire. So I'm going to give what I hope is an interesting talk on the Rifles in North Africa. Very much a broad brush with a few selections of perhaps the highlights of the campaign, but I'm certainly more than happy to go into more detail, particularly in questions. I suppose the first thing, or the first thing that strikes anyone when they go to Egypt is how contemplation of the pyramids and ancient Egypt can telescope time and make 3,000 years or even 5,000 years seem like the blink of an eye. And it seems in that sense quite strange to be examining things which are still very much within living memory and yet seem almost just as much part of a changed and a lost world. It takes a certain effort of mind to remember or to think that just 70 odd years ago, Britain still had one of the largest empires that the world had ever seen, and that much of the fighting in North Africa in the Second World War was for imperial reasons. So just to remind you, a map of the world as it existed in 1940, with Egypt and the Sudan sadly not being in British pink. But nonetheless, the competition between particularly Britain and Italy with its imperial possessions in Libya and what is now Ethiopia and Somaliland, being very much part and parcel of this struggle. So the world has most definitely changed since those days. And I think if people are unfamiliar with 1940 and the war in North Africa, they're even less familiar with the fact that Britain's relationship with Egypt, or certainly its modern relationship with Egypt, really began in 1882 with the bombardment of Alexandria and eventually the British takeover with an expeditionary force under Wolseley. I think it's important just to bear some of that context in mind as we go on. But there's no question that the reason that there is a war in the desert in 1940 is due to the ambition of the Italian leader Benito Mussolini. The Second World War, after all, certainly when it began in September 1939, people in Britain, and indeed the British Army, expected there to be a war in France and Flanders, not terribly unlike the First World War. And of course, as it turns out, for much of the period from 1940 to 1942, the British Army does most of its fighting in the western deserts of Egypt and Libya, in many respects quite unexpectedly. This is the theatre that comes to define British actions, and indeed these names become household names in Britain as people learn the strange words of Tobruk, Bardia, Mersa Matruh, and eventually El Alamein. And I've done my best to work out all of the different battalions of the Rifles Regiment as it is today, which served in those campaigns, with the Rifle Brigade and the King's Royal Rifle Corps very much to the fore. And I'm going to focus particularly, or give you some insight, into the battles of Bedafom, Sidi Rezeg, and of course El Alamein, which also sees the Durham Light Infantry, now within the Rifles, also taking part. So this is a major campaign, and it's a major commitment of British resources and troops. But it's clearly also that the Rifle Brigade and the King's Royal Rifle Corps are, in some respects, at the heart of this story. They are serving in Egypt before the declaration of war, and they have been mechanised. They aren't just lorried infantry, they are motor infantry battalions. They're fully motorised. All of their soldiers can be lifted either in lorries or in the small universal carriers. And they have a high complement of anti-tank guns from the beginning of the war. So they are truly mechanised. They're at the cutting edge of the mechanisation process in the British Army. And that gives them a particular value in the wide open deserts of Egypt and Libya. And do forgive me for putting up the next slide, but it makes an important point. This is the centre point, the HQ of the 4th Armoured Brigade during the Battle of Crusader. And if you can make sense of it, then you're a better person than I am. But it shows that across these vast open spaces, with the benefit of mechanisation, the mobility that was possible was quite extraordinary, to a level that had never been achieved before in war. And at the heart of that was the 7th Armoured Division with the King's Royal Rifle Corps and the Rifle Brigade acting as their motor battalion infantry to support the armour and the artillery. So this start of what becomes a very long war in a quite unexpected fashion is actually begun by a very old armoured car, actually from the First World War, although slightly modified. When Mussolini declares war, the British forces are quite determined not to lose the initiative. and from the start they actually cross the frontier and go into action against the Italians in their various forts and fortified areas. And the Rifle Brigade and King's Royal Rifle Corps, in terms of scouting and picking up Italian patrols, are in there from the very start. But the war does indeed swing like a pendulum across this landscape over the course of the next 2 years. And if any of you get seasick, then I will be to blame. But the campaign in many respects opens, yes, with British raiding, but with an Italian offensive into Egypt in September 1940, drives forwards about 60 miles and then stops. The Italians have far greater numbers than the British. They have in the region of 60,000 men in their advance. The British forces only about 36,000 troops, so they're badly outnumbered. But what they lack in numbers, they certainly make up for in motivation. And in December 1940, General Wavell and General Richard O'Connor, in charge of the Western Desert Force, launches what was called Operation Compass, and which Wavell tells Churchill will be a 5-day raid. But of course, Wavell has actually angered Churchill by giving him no indication of this happening before the troops actually start moving. And very, very quickly, as you can see from this, and given all of the scouting that had gone on before, which found a path through the Italian defences, the British and indeed Indian forces are able to encircle and capture the leading Italian forts. Very, very quickly, the Italian resistance collapses, and at one point, towards the end of the 5-day raid, which is completed in 3 days, a young subaltern is asked for an estimate of prisoners, and he replies that he has about 20 acres of officers and 100 acres of men. It's quite an extraordinary achievement. 38,000 prisoners at the cost of 600 casualties. And one should certainly not give the impression that the Italians are not fighting, but they are quite outmatched by the much more mobile, mechanised British and Indian forces. I particularly like this watercolour of a detachment of 2nd Rifle Brigade celebrating Christmas in the Libyan hills in December 1940, as it gives that impression of the colours in Egypt and Libya, the sense of distance, the sense of scale, and the sense of isolation. And it's easy to be romantic about the campaigns in Egypt and Libya during the Second World War, but of course there really was nothing romantic about them. These were hard campaigns fought in very austere conditions, where the men were generally given 1 to 1.5 gallons of water per day, which included topping up the radiators of their vehicles with. So very, very short in terms of water rations, and subsisting on bully beef and biscuit day after day in the blue. And yet many men actually did come to, if not enjoy, then perhaps appreciate the western deserts of Egypt and Libya for the wide spaces and the sometimes beautiful sunrises. Operation Compass goes on. After that stunning success, Wavell and O'Connor realise that more can be done, and the Western Desert Force pushes on into Libya, with Bardia, a frontier fortress, falling in early January, and then Tobruk, the major port, falling at the end of January. And 7th Armoured, including the Rifle Brigade and the King's Royal Rifle Corps, drive through unreconnoitred desert to cut off the Italian retreat, as the Italian 10th Army goes along the Cyrenaican Bulge 7th Armoured is directed by O'Connor across the desert to cut off their retreat. And again, in one of the most dramatic events of the Desert War, Combe Force, as it's known, gets to the coast road just before the lead Italian troops, who are quite dumbfounded by the fact that there are any British there at all. They think they're 140 miles behind them. And as you can see there, 2nd Rifle Brigade with the 11th Hussars, they were actually there to protect the guns of the Royal Horse Artillery and to act as the final blocking force to prevent any Italians breaking through. And that means that over the course of those days, the 5th to the 7th of February 1941, they fight an incredibly intense action to prevent the Italians breaking through. It's later called an epic in the history of the regiment. And after the Italians mount multiple attempts to try and break through this blocking force, they suddenly, on the 7th of February, all give up. Now that may seem strange, but in the desert, if you can't break through, if you can't be resupplied, then there's a strict limit to how long you can actually exist. And having been desperate to break through, the Italians realise that the game is up and begin to surrender en masse. This photograph on the right shows the Rifle Brigade's officers' mess tent, which during a lull in the action, the officer in command of the HQ company hadn't realised that there was a great deal of action going on and had decided to erect the tent, which then acted as an aiming mark through much of the rest of the battle. And here we see the foremost Italian tank, which penetrated very close to the officers' mess tent. But there were another 26 Italian tanks strewed about the desert just out of shot. So it's quite an extraordinary battle. And with it, the Italian 10th Army is captured lock, stock and barrel. That figure of 110,000 prisoners includes those taken in the 5-day raid. So it's not 110,000 all at the Battle of Bedafon, but nonetheless it's an extraordinary achievement. And 2nd Rifle Brigade was very much there in the fore. And believe it or not, although the anti-tank gunners actually suffered many heavier casualties, 2nd Rifle Brigade in this action suffered 3 killed and 4 wounded. Quite remarkable. With that, it would appear that the gate to Tripoli and the end of the campaign is entirely open. But for reasons which remain controversial to this very day, General O'Connor is not given permission to continue the pursuit. And in fact, the pursuit may not well have been possible, physically possible, because of the inability to supply the Western Desert Force on the next 300 miles towards Tripoli. And so the advance stops at El Aguila, a name which may well have become familiar again to you through the Libyan civil war. The Western Desert Force is withdrawn to Cairo and Alexandria to regroup, and fresh, and it has to be said, inexperienced troops that haven't become familiar with navigating in the desert, take over their positions. And in one of the reports that is written at the end of December 1940, or January, February 1940, they are actually quite prescient. We have learnt many lessons and gained much valuable experience, but we must guard against any tendency to apply them rigidly or unimaginatively in future circumstances, which may prove very different. Of course, the tragedy, in many respects the irony, is that conditions in the Western Desert themselves change very rapidly. with the Italian Empire literally on its knees and ripe for the taking, Adolf Hitler decides that his Italian ally cannot be seen to suffer this humiliating collapse, and he sends what was known as a blocking force under a rather energetic Major General Erwin Rommel to block the British advance to Tripoli. Rommel was given strict instructions not to advance, not to mount any offensive, but simply to block the British move. But of course, as I'm sure you're all aware, Rommel has ideas of his own. And equally, while some of the Italian units in the desert had fought extremely well and with great courage, much of their equipment was obsolete, which made the resistance often much more difficult. The German Afrika Korps, as it arrives from February, March and into April 1941, are equipped with much better equipment, have training and doctrine which they have tried and tested in both Poland and France, and proved to be an altogether much tougher opponent. And so Rommel actually mounts an offensive in April 1941 and drives all the way back across the desert to Tobruk, which is then brought under siege in the famous 6-month siege of Tobruk, with the garrison, certainly in the initial stages, being drawn from the 9th Australian Division. That sets up a terrible pressure upon Wavell to break that siege, to relieve Tobruk, and find a way through the Axis lines. And in both two operations, Brevity and Battleaxe, they're both failed operations, with Tobruk remaining firmly under siege by the Axis forces. And that summer of 1941 is one in which neither side can really prevail over the other. And of course, it's also that summer where Adolf Hitler's attention, having been drawn to this strange and unexpected theatre, is of course shifted to Russia. It's not until November 1941, with the Western Desert Force now rechristened the 8th Army, to which some soldiers at the time rather sardonically quipped, if this is the 8th Army, where's the other 7 armies? And 8th Army, reinvigorated, now at a much greater scale and scope, mounts Operation Crusader on the 18th of November to attempt to relieve Tobruk. And it's an incredibly powerful drive, but you can begin to see what goes wrong actually right from the start, which is that General Cunningham takes his army on a drive towards Tobruk. Fine, all is well. But then the British forces begin to disperse. They begin to fight in different directions. And strangely enough, on the 18th of November, they achieve complete surprise. Rommel has no concept, no idea that there is a British offensive, even in the offing. And it takes him a number of days to begin to react. That was time which, sadly, in this case, was wasted. And if I show you a slightly more detailed map, you can see the way that British, New Zealand and Indian forces begin to be dispersed across the Libyan desert, where everybody recognises that actually linking up with Tobruk is the critical factor, and 7th Armoured Division is sent on a mission towards Sidi Rezegh to try and begin that link-up. But instead of that being a powerful drive of the whole of the 8th Army, it's now just one armoured division. More of which later. Sidi Rezegh is, of course, the tomb of a Muslim saint. Sidi simply meaning saint in Arabic. And this tomb and the airfield just adjoining the tomb see some of the most bitter and intense fighting of the whole of the Desert Campaign. On the 19th of November, the support group of 7th Armoured Division begins its drive towards Sidi Rezegh, and by the 21st of November, the 1st King's Royal Rifle Corps and A Company of the 2nd Rifle Brigade are able to mount an attack to try and seize the airfield. They recognise that only by getting up onto the lip of that escarpment are they going to be able to control the whole area. And it's later written of this attack, which is mounted over open ground, that carried out in the face of heavy opposition across open ground and with little opportunity for reconnaissance, was one of the outstanding exploits of the Desert War. 1st King's Royal Rifle Corps take over 700 prisoners from the Axis defenders. And Sidi Rezegh is now firmly in British control, and it looks like the relief of Tobruk might only be a matter of hours away. But of course, what has been missed is the fact that Rommel, the Germans and Italians begin to recover from the shock of surprise that the British have mounted an assault, and Rommel concentrates his armour, the famous 21st Panzer Division and 15th Panzer Division, and on the 22nd of November there is one of the greatest battles of the Desert War at Sidi Rezegh. Over 120 tanks of the 21st Panzer Division launch an assault on the beleaguered 1st King's Royal Rifle Corps and one company of the Rifle Brigade. Brigadier Jock Campbell, the commander of the support group, drives around the battlefield in an open staff car during that day, trying to find British tanks to lend support, and he leads the 4th Armoured Brigade in to help, which leads to an enormous swirling dogfight of an armoured battle just on the borders of the airfield. But 4th Armoured Brigade ultimately, the next slide shows their tanks, ultimately is defeated very heavily by the superior German forces, and with only a few anti-tank guns left, which are knocked out one by the German tanks, eventually 1st King's Royal Rifle Corps are overrun. The 25-pounder artillery gunners with them fight and die by their guns, but the position is indeed overrun. And part of the reason is that the British equipment in November 1941, while 8th Army has large numbers of tanks, they are simply not a match for the German types at that stage. And the 2-pounder gun, often mounted on a truck during the desert fighting, which had been perfectly adequate in 1940, in the winter of 1941 is simply inadequate. And the M3 light tanks, actually the first American tanks used in the war, these are the tanks that 4th Armoured Brigade had, but they're simply not capable of coping with the Germans on an equal footage. After 3 days of fighting, the British have lost over 500 tanks to the Axis 100. And the Rifle Brigade history, eventually the rest of the support group have to withdraw from Sidi Rezegh airfield after having fought bitterly for over 3 days. And the Rifle Brigade history later says that it was even more disheartening to have failed when we knew we had fought well. But they were up against a very different opponent. And Sidi Rezegh becomes a byword, certainly amongst 8th Army veterans, for the ferocity of the fighting. The whole airfield is literally littered with wrecks of British and German tanks and guns and all kinds of litter of battle. And although I've never been to Sidi Rezegh. A colleague of mine has, and he says that certainly the tanks and guns have gone, but the litter of battle is still there 70 years later. Now, you might think that after such intense fighting, that experience of the 7th Armoured Division and the King's Royal Rifle Corps and Rifle Brigade, that in fact the British would not manage to relieve Tobruk. But in fact, they are able to, by dint of perseverance, even more intense battles that swirl around the area, and the fact that the Royal Navy is able to cut Rommel's supply lines. By the middle of December 1941, Rommel is the one who has to admit defeat and withdraw back to El Aguila. But of course there are wider events in the war going on as well, which impact upon this theatre, and reinforcements which were to have been sent to General Auchinleck and the 8th Army are of course diverted to the Far East when Japan mounts its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and Malaya. And thus the 8th Army, having achieved a very hard-fought victory, is not able to fully exploit that victory, just as it had before in 1940. Even worse, Rommel, whose supply lines are then re-established, and supplies and troops pour into the theatre, he bounces back incredibly quickly against a now weakened 8th Army. And he bounces back towards Tobruk very, very rapidly in January and February 1942. The two sides eye each other warily, and by May, both are on the verge of mounting an offensive. But this time, it's Rommel that beats the British to the throw. And the Battle of Gazala, which I'm not going to go into any huge detail, but it's one of the most mystifying of the Desert War. The British who fight in it, including the Rifle Brigade and King's Royal Rifle Corps, who act as part of the screen on that southern flank, are mystified and bewildered by the defeat that is inflicted upon them. And most historians have been ever since. I found in the US archives perhaps the answer, which is that by May 1942, an American defense attaché, Colonel Bonner Fellers, was given open access to all British material. Some of this story is quite well known to intelligence historians. But what I found in the US archives was that Bonner Fellers was sending back to Washington, he was following this battle very, very carefully, but he was sending back to Washington the grid references of the HQs of all the British formations. Now, that wouldn't have mattered if the code that he was using had not been broken. But it had. The Italian intelligence service had broken that code, and every message that he sent to Washington was intercepted by them, and a copy sent to Rommel within about an hour to 2 hours. There's a reason that Rommel called Bonner Fellers my bonny fellow, or the good source. And one of the mystifying things about Gazala is that British HQs were overrun not once, not twice, but 3 times, with the 7th Armoured Division being the first. And every time the British attempted to organise their forces, the Germans seemed to know where they were and pounce first. Well, it's only a theory, but I suspect that Bonner Fellers may have had something to do with it. The result of that bitter, bewildering fight leads to one of the greatest defeats of the British Army in the Second World War, which is why you may not have heard of the Battle of Gazala. And it leads to Rommel's greatest moment of triumph when, on the 21st of June 1942, he is able to drive into Tobruk, the town which had resisted capture throughout the previous year. The Axis plan by this stage was that Rommel should halt and that the island of Malta should be taken before Rommel pushes on into Egypt. But Rommel was not one for fixed plans, and he believed that the moment had come to drive the British out of Egypt altogether. And so he drives on from Tobruk with barely a pause towards Alexandria and Cairo. And General Auchinleck determines that the place to stand is at El Alamein. This is the small, obscure railway halt of El Alamein in 1942. At that point, there was literally just that railway halt building. And El Alamein in Arabic simply means two flags, from the two surveyors' flags that were stuck in the ground there in the 1920s when they were surveying the railway. So this very famous name was a tiny, tiny place, really non-existent in 1942. And the men of 8th Army, including the Rifle Brigade and King's Royal Rifle Corps, they've been fighting all the way back in a fighting withdrawal from Gazala. And eventually they're deployed, some of them anyway, on the southern flank of the 8th Army at Hamaimat. And this is what this is their reaction when they pick up the BBC on the 30th of June 1942. When the riflemen heard the suave voice of the BBC announcer reporting that the 8th Army had reached the Alamein line, they looked round at the empty desert, indistinguishable from the miles of sand to east and west, and commented as riflemen only can. There was no Alamein line. There were some boxes, there were some fortifications, but there was certainly no Alamein line. And yet, in Britain, the 1st of July is always, I think, remembered for the great losses on the Somme in 1916, certainly in military history. The 1st of July is always remembered for that. In fact, it should be remembered as well, perhaps equally, for the fact that Rommel's Afrika Korps is indeed halted for the first time on the 1st of July 1942. And after 3 days of intense fighting, Rommel has to recognise that he has shot his bolt and that he won't be driving into Alexandria in just a matter of hours, as he had believed just a few days before. Well, again, the Rifle Brigade and King's Royal Rifle Corps take a full part in the July battles of Alamein. I'm not going to go into any great detail, but Auchinleck and the 8th Army mount offensive after offensive to try and break Rommel's army where it stands, and very unfortunately, and perhaps only by a whisker, failed to do so. Rommel is halted, the gates of Egypt have been slammed shut, but 8th Army launches 3 failed offensives and suffers 13,000 casualties over the course of that month. Now, in that circumstance, with the Prime Minister having to face a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons on the 1st of July, Winston Churchill by now wants not just a stalemate, and he certainly doesn't want another defeat, he wants a victory. And so he comes out to Egypt to sort things out. Here he is arriving close to the front on the 5th of August 1942 with General Auchinleck. And he has come quite determined to shake up the command in the Middle East. It's important when you look at photographs not to read too much into body language. But I think with this one, it's quite obvious. Later to this photograph being taken, Churchill went with Dorman Smith, the figure furthest to your left, to try and explain Auchinleck's plans for the future. And Churchill would have none of it. Dorman Smith later said it was a little like being caged with a gorilla. But the man who did impress Churchill is the man in the middle, Strafford Gott, of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, who had served with them from the start in 1940, who knew the desert like the back of his hand, and was a legend throughout the Desert Army. And he was the man which Churchill decided should lead the 8th Army. Again, you shouldn't read too much into photographs, but I always can't help but remark that when Auchinleck waved goodbye to Churchill, he was waving goodbye to his career as well. So, in fact, the man that Churchill personally selected to lead 8th Army in the next phase of its history was not Montgomery, but Strafford Gott. Tragically, he was going on leave in Cairo, and instead of driving, because he had to hold a conference of his 13th Corps by then, he decided to fly. And during that flight, his plane was intercepted by German fighter aircraft. It was shot down, and he was killed. Now, there's a coda to that story, which I have to say I didn't know until a few years ago, which was that the pilots of the aircraft survived, and that he spent much of his life after the war trying to find the German pilots that had shot him down. And he found a very elderly German pilot who had indeed shot him down. The German pilot was, I think, 94 when they met. And that German pilot had said that when he got back to base, he was met by an intelligence officer who clapped him on the back and said, "You got him. You got General Gott." Now, at that point, Jimmy James, the pilot, was still in the desert, desperately trying to find help, which suggests that the shooting down of the plane carrying General Gott was actually an intelligence operation, and that there was probably a leak in Cairo that made that possible. It's going to be almost impossible to prove at this date. But in fact, there are a number of other instances of high-ranking and important generals being shot down and intelligence being part of that. Admiral Yamamoto being only one example of that. So with Gott's death, that particular link with the King's Royal Rifle Corps, I'm afraid, tragically ended. And the new broom was the one that we're all much more familiar with, General Alexander being the new Commander-in-Chief Middle East, and General Bernard Montgomery becoming commander of the 8th Army. This photograph taken just after he had arrived in Cairo, and so he hadn't quite developed the persona which becomes so famous. Now, 8th Army then has spent a month in quite a febrile state with all these command changes taking place, digging in and expecting another offensive by Rommel's Panzer Army Africa. And at the end of August, Rommel does indeed mount that offensive. And it's mounted when Rommel understands, he recognises that he doesn't actually have sufficient fuel to carry out the move. He hopes that he will capture supplies from the British as he had done on so many occasions in the past. Now this battle, which becomes Montgomery's first battle, there's no question that it was actually planned by General Gott, even though it was conducted by Montgomery. And the role of the Rifle Brigade in King's Royal Rifle Corps was actually highly significant in this, because as motor infantry and part of the screen watching for any Axis attack, they're very much in the front line, and they mount a model fighting withdrawal from in front of the British minefields as the Afrika Korps advances. They act as a rear guard, trying to impose as much delay as they possibly can on the Afrika Korps as it pushes forwards. And as part of this, as they're fighting on the ground with their anti-tank guns and machine guns, during the night, the Desert Air Force is weighing into the fight as the Afrika Korps attempts to drive very slowly through the gaps in the British minefields. And Major Woods, commanding a company of the 1st King's Royal Rifle Corps at Hamaimat, which is one of the great hills on the edge of the Katara Depression, said it was one of the most awe-inspiring sights I shall ever see, I think. There were seldom less than 20 flares in the air at any one time. These are flares dropped by the aircraft so that they can see where they're bombing. And the whole valley, with its mass of the Afrika Korps stationary in front of the minefields, was lit up like a huge orange fairyland. So right from the start, with that tenacious fighting withdrawal, Rommel's timetable for this battle goes badly awry. And when they eventually do indeed reach the Alam Halfa Ridge, which is what the British, the name of the battle comes from, the Afrika Korps is comprehensively held and eventually has to withdraw. That means, of course, that the next battle will be a British offensive, the third Battle of El Alamein, and the one that we're much more familiar with. But even here, in fact, the origins of the plan for the third Battle of Alamein actually derive from some of Auchinleck's ideas before he's unceremoniously sacked. But nonetheless, the plan is to mount a major offensive in the north while persuading the Germans and Italians that there will be an attack in the south. And Montgomery recognises that this is going to be a real dogfight, which is going to last for several days before the 8th Army can break through. Using very sophisticated concealment techniques, the 8th Army is able to conceal many of the 882 guns, not quite 1,000, 882 guns that it brings into position to start that very famous barrage on the night of the 23rd of October. And in the aptly named Operation Lightfoot, the 9th Australian Division, 51st Highland Division, 2nd New Zealand Division and 1st South African Division have to assault over 4 miles of open desert and across the Axis minefields to try and make a breach. So this major attack in the north. Meanwhile, 7th Armoured Division actually mounts an assault in the south, but although they're able to get through the first Axis minefield, they're not able to get through the second, and eventually they're withdrawn. Now, Montgomery's intention had been that all of the infantry attacks would secure the line, the objective line there, and that the sappers would be able to cut gaps in the Axis minefields in just one night. That proved impossible, and it meant that further attacks had to be mounted to try and cut further into the Axis defences. The battle goes on at a huge pitch of intensity for the next few days. And then in one of the most famous engagements of the Battle of Alamein, and certainly in the Rifle Brigade's history, there is the action known as Snipe. So the infantry divisions have managed to close up to the objective line, but there is still the need to push further through the Axis minefields. And it's decided that one of the motor brigades will actually drive forwards at night and take up advanced positions in front of 8th Army to act as pivots to then support the drive of the armour through. That's as far as the plan actually goes, because it doesn't quite work out according to plan. It means that 2nd Rifle Brigade drive towards the Snipe position, and 2nd King's Royal Rifle Corps towards the Woodcock position, as you can see in front of the existing 8th Army lines. And they drive forwards on the night of the 26th and into the 27th of October, with only a vague idea of where they are by the time the sun comes up. There's also been huge confusion over where they actually are, with the 51st Highland Division and the artillery claiming that 1st Armoured Division was at least 1,000 yards off in terms of its map reading. And so it proved. So when dawn comes on the 27th of October, the 2nd Rifle Brigade and 2nd King's Royal Rifle Corps only have a very vague idea as to where they were. The Rifle Corps actually spend a relatively quiet day. But by good luck or misfortune, 2nd Rifle Brigade are now in advance of the 8th Army lines at precisely the point that Rommel has chosen for his main counterattack. And in a strange repeat of Sidi Rezegh, during that day, Rommel has collected the 21st Panzer Division, brought it from the south of the Alamein line, and launches it in a counterattack against the British positions. Unbeknownst to them, there is one British motor battalion reinforced with anti-tank guns from the 239th anti-tank battery sitting in a slight shallow depression right in the middle of the path of that German attack. This is what Kidney Ridge actually looks like. And I'm afraid, as with all photographs, you can probably just make out the fact that there is a slight depression in the bend in the road. If you're actually there, obviously it's much clearer. But that is Kidney Ridge, an indistinguishable slight depression in the middle of the desert. The Snipe position is about 1,000 yards towards you from that photograph, and Woodcock is just to the left of that photograph. So nondescript piece of desert. But as the sun comes up on the 27th of October, the riflemen realise that they're actually surrounded by German tanks from the 15th Panzer Division and the Italian Ariete Division. And they find themselves in action from dawn throughout that long, hot day, with multiple waves of attacks by German and Italian armour. But it would appear, particularly from the Italian accounts, and having paced out where I thought Snipe was, the desert begins to change. It becomes there's a depression. You can no longer see as far as you can, even from that photograph. And And there's very soft, hummocky sand, which is most definitely noted in all of the accounts. I would suspect that, in fact, when they were dug in, the guns of the 2nd Rifle Brigade and their slit trenches were pretty much invisible to the German and Italian tanks until they were almost on them. And that might well explain why 2nd Rifle Brigade is able to survive in such a dangerous location. Nonetheless, they have to beat off multiple attacks during the day. They're shelled by the 8th Army, who also doesn't know who they are. And at one point, some Sherman tanks come up and again begin shelling them from the British side. So they're out in the open on their own and having to cope against the whole of 21st Panzer Division attacking them. The height of the battle is depicted in Cuneo's famous painting. But I think the one thing that's missing is that sense of a depression, that sense that the gun is actually much lower in the ground rather than being quite exposed as it is there. Sergeant Calliston, who you can see here, and the Colonel, Victor Turner, acting as his number 2. Sergeant Calliston later said that with the gun with only 1 or 2 rounds left, Lieutenant Toms ran for his jeep. This is him here, which had 4 boxes of ammo on board. God knows how he got to it. They were machine gunning all the way. But they managed to get the boxes of ammunition and knock out 5 German and Italian tanks with that number of rounds. And engagements like that are going on all around the snipe position, not all the time, but throughout the day. By the end of the day, when 2nd Rifle Brigade withdraw, they have knocked out at least 32 enemy tanks and possibly 15 to 20 more that were recovered. And they've suffered 14 killed, 44 wounded, and 1 missing. It would surprise no one then that Montgomery sees to it that 2nd Rifle Brigade is lionised and that its feat of arms is duly publicised. 21 members of 2nd Rifle Brigade were decorated for gallantry, and at this distance in time you might actually say that was too few given what they managed to achieve. There's actually a sad coda to the snipe operation as well, because the force that was meant to relieve them, the 133rd Lorried Infantry Brigade, it was sent to relieve Snipe and Woodcock, and these are troops who are much less familiar with the desert, much less familiar with how they should operate, and one of their battalions, the 4th Royal Sussex, drives straight into a 15th Panzer Leaguer and is captured almost to a man. 342 men go into the bag very, very quickly, because before they can set up for defence, they've been surrounded and captured. And they suffer 47 dead in that tragedy. So when fighting in the Western Desert, depending on which part of desert, depending on where you were, and particularly at night, where navigation could be very, very difficult, sometimes these things could almost be a matter of luck. The battle continues. The Australians attack towards the coast, drawing Rommel's attention away from that central sector, and by the 2nd of November 1942, with Montgomery under intense pressure from London to achieve a breakthrough, he launches Operation Supercharge. This is, in some respects, a miniature of Operation Lightfoot, 4,000 yards by 4,000 yards, to try and break through. And the 2 brigades that are used, one is a Highland Brigade and the other is a brigade of the Durham Light Infantry. 720 guns are used in a 4,000 yard frontage in a huge, massive curtain or carpet of shells designed to destroy the Axis defences. And one of the officers that witnessed it later said this: "Clouds of dust and smoke arose, blotting out the desert which so short a time ago had seemed so vast. Each man found himself in a diminished world, inhabited by himself and at most by 3 or 4 others. Somewhere near him was an officer or sergeant with a compass, trying to walk a straight course through the inferno for more than 2 miles to an objective which was only a pencil line on the map." Well, quite astonishingly, both brigades did indeed manage to achieve their objective line. But through the next day of the 2nd of November, there is another almighty armoured clash around Tel El Akakir, which finally writes down Rommel's last armoured reserves. And eventually he is forced to withdraw. By the 4th of November 1942, the 8th Army is out into the open with huge traffic jams of tanks and vehicles having to navigate the minefield gaps. But Rommel's army has finally been broken, and the famous Battle of El Alamein has been won. It's given to few generals to dine that evening with one of their opposite numbers, Major General von Thoma, commander of the Afrika Korps, was captured that day, and he dines with Montgomery that evening, where they swap their impressions of the battle, almost 18th century in a way. But when Churchill heard of that, and of course Churchill knew only too well that Montgomery was a teetotaler and didn't smoke, and so he could only say, "Poor, poor von Thoma." And so certainly the received memory is that the October Battle of Alamein results in the final defeat of Rommel's army, as indeed it does, after 12 days of intense fighting and another 13,000 casualties. The remnants of Rommel's army may well have escaped, but this was, in many respects, the signal victory of the 8th Army in the desert. And no one was under any illusions, with Montgomery now wearing his famous beret, who had won the victory. And of course this film was the only time that the British Army and RAF film units were ever awarded an Oscar. They changed the rules afterwards to make sure they couldn't win another one. We're all perhaps familiar with Churchill's phrases about El Alamein. But I would hope that after the glimpses, I suppose, of some of those earlier combats that I've mentioned, that while these are stirring phrases, they don't necessarily sum up the experience of the Desert War. So El Alamein can seem almost detached and at one remove from us today in our very changed world. But when you read the accounts of the 2nd Rifle Brigade, the King's Royal Rifle Corps, and indeed the Durham Light Infantry, you can see this indeed as an epic story of the Rifles, which stands with its other great campaigns and battles, such as the Peninsular War. So while it may be removed from us in time, lost in time, it is most certainly not forgotten. Thank you.
We've got time for sort of 5 or 10 minutes of questions before we move through for a drink. Do you want to move now? You're looking a bit sort of uncomfortable. Yeah?
I do, I am fine.
You're okay? Sure? Okay. So, over the floor.
Can I ask
Yeah.
how much longer did the fighting go on after Alamein?
And where do the Italians feature in all of this?
Oh, well, the Italians are very much involved throughout this campaign. And of course, it's only by virtue of time, in a sense, that the campaign then goes on to Tripoli and through into Tunisia, with the Afrika Korps finally surrendering, along with a large part of the Italian army, in May 1943.
Apart from trying to prevent the Germans getting through the minefields, you haven't mentioned much about the air forces. Do they not have much of a factor in the campaign?
They are a huge factor, and I certainly don't want to give the impression that the air forces aren't important. Quite the reverse. The problem is one of selection and focus, not that they're not highly important. And the air forces aren't just important in terms of the battlefront, which by the October Battle of 1942, the Desert Air Force very much rules the skies over El Alamein. But they're very, very important in the complex aero-naval battle out in the Mediterranean, sinking Rommel's tankers and supply ships, choking him of the supplies that he needs to conduct these battles. So the air forces are absolutely vital in this whole story.
Sorry, the arrival of the First Army in Tunisia came at what stage? Much after this?
They arrive in November 1942, but at the other side of the Mediterranean, in Algeria. And they are the British First Army and the British Eighth Army. When they meet, it's a wonderful study in clashes of cultures, because the First Army has come from home. They have olive drab and khaki painted vehicles. They have quite strict standards of dress and discipline, and they're meeting what looks like a gypsy convoy of the Eighth Army. And of course, the Eighth Army by this stage has developed quite a high regard for itself, and sadly don't necessarily see the members of the First Army as being, proper soldiers. And this sense of rivalry as to whether you were a First Army man or an Eighth Army man lasts for quite some time.
You mentioned the shooting down of General Gott. There was a biography of him published 24 months ago, and the author of that confirms that it was an intelligence operation, but he also suggests that Gott would not have been able to resist Churchill's pressures and would probably have wanted to move much more quickly, rather than consolidating as Montgomery did. And therefore it was perhaps, it's very unfortunate for Mr. Gott, but perhaps the appointment of Montgomery was what led to the victory at El Alamein. Do you have any comments?
Well, these are one of the tantalising aspects, I suppose, of history, in the sense that we'll never quite know. General Brooke, who was there with Churchill, he certainly felt, his recorded opinion of General Gott was that he was too tired. Not that he was not a very fine soldier, but that he was too tired. He'd been fighting, after all, for over 2 years in the desert. Was that assessment correct, or was it not? Now, quite frankly, we'll never quite know. My own suspicion is that the Battle of Alam Halfa would have been fought very differently by Gott, and that when the Afrika Korps was sitting immobile at the base of the Alam Halfa ridge, I suspect that Gott may well have attempted to cut them off and destroy them there. Whether that would have been successful or not, we will never know.
And a quick plug, the book about Strafvergot is on sale in the shop downstairs. Very good purchase a copy.
At what stage did British tanks start improving their quality and capability in reference to their comparison to the Panzers?
It's in 1942, but it's actually American tanks. It's the Grant tank, which first sees action at Gazala, and then the Sherman tank, which first sees action at the Third Battle of Alamein. The story of the British tank industry in the Second World War is a long and involved one, and quite a painful one. But in many respects, Britain, particularly in terms of army equipment, take a long time to recover from Dunkirk. And I think it's the disruption actually caused by Dunkirk that really causes the problem. The 2nd Rifle Brigade at Snipe were equipped with 6-pounder guns, which were more than capable of knocking out German tanks. And that's that's one of the factors that makes Snipe a very different operation from Sidi Rezegh. But the 6-pounder gun had been on the stocks. It had been ready to go into production in June, July 1940. And of course, it has to be shelved because we've got no anti-tank guns at all. And to switch production from the 2-pounder to the 6-pounder in the midst of that crisis is impossible. So Dunkirk actually has a very long-lasting legacy in terms of the equipping of the British Army.
How do you see the campaign unfolding if Malta hadn't been taken, and why do you think that the Axis as forces didn't try to take over?
Well, Hitler, and in fact many German commanders, aren't terribly keen on the idea of Malta, mainly because of their experience of Crete the year before. I think the Axis in North Africa caught on the horns of a dilemma in the summer of 1942 because they're at their seemingly most powerful. But Rommel recognises, and many other Axis commanders recognise, that this is only a brief period, because when the United States is able to come into the war more fully, this window of opportunity will close. And had the Axis forces stopped after Tobruk and taken Malta, they would have secured their supply line. But by the time they were ready to attack again, not only would the 8th Army have begun to recover, but the United States would have been transfusing power into the theatre. So it's a much wider dilemma than it appears simply looking at what happens in the desert.
Last one?
There was no mention of the, in fact, I'm not aware of any great mention of air transport in the North Africa campaign. Was it used at all? To what extent was it used?
Actually, quite dramatically. You may well be familiar with the Takoradi air route, which is constructed all across Africa, where aircraft are shipped in crates from the UK to, I'm going to get this right, West Africa, built and then flown across Africa to act as replacements and reinforcements in North Africa. So air transport is used in all kinds of ways. During Operation Crusader, those American tanks that I showed, which use different ammunition to British tanks, they use 37mm American ammunition. There's a real crisis of shortage of that ammunition, and stocks are flown over from the United States to Libya to deal with that. So air transport is used on quite a large scale, but by no means as large as just a few years later, for example, in Burma.
Right. Neil, thank you very much indeed. I think you'll all agree with me that's a tour de force. Never looked at the notes, knew the subject absolutely backwards, and had the brilliant ability to put it over in a very interesting, fascinating way. Particularly an interesting, fascinating way because Sidi Rezegh and Snipe are two actions which stand out in the Desert Campaign for the 60th and the Rifle Brigade. If you want to have a wander through the museum on the way out, downstairs, of course, there is the diorama of Snipe and the medal collections of the numerous people who won awards there, and there is also the Cuneo painting of Baie de Femme with the Italians being rounded up there. And as I said earlier on, we have next year Vic Gregg come to speak who was actually one of the riflemen sitting blocking that road and stopping the Italians coming along. But let me not detract from you, Niall. Thank you very much indeed for a really fascinating and very, very entertaining talk.